Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Efficiency Equation podcast. I am your host, Konstantin Paradizov, co-founder and CEO of Utopia. And today we have Julie Whitten of Whitten Consulting. How has it been, Julie? We've met at the Connected Worker Conference in October, right? And for us, it's been busy since then. What about you?
It's been good. It's funny because when you start out on your own, you never know what to expect. And I have to say that conference led me to a lot of great connections like yourself.
Thank you.
Between that and the networking, I've been very busy, and I'm happy to tell you a little bit more throughout the show.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing that brought us together today to this podcast recording from that conference was the topic of change management. So I came away from the conference after having listened to a lot of people and talked to a lot of people in the hallway with the understanding that change management in US manufacturing is not just a hot topic, it's a disaster. And there's a lot of people who say something when they're presenting about it, but then in the hallway admit that they don't have it under control. And one of the reasons why a light bulb went off in my mind when we met at that conference was that when you spoke, I thought, wow, this is the one person that sounds credible when she talks about change management. And when you went through the framework with the zoo, I loved it. So I hope to hear more about it today, and let's dive in. So
Sounds great.
before we talk about the change management itself, let's just give a few short scenarios, a few short anecdotes that we can then relate to as we talk about change management. So at the conference, at the Connected Worker Conference, there was a company that presented how they manage change. And we're not going to give names because we don't want to hammer them, but it was actually a very interesting example that we can use to illustrate the points today. So there was a large multinational company that rolled out a mobile platform to its sites. And the story was that they came, they rolled it out, they explained everything, and then the same person says, okay, and we visited that site a year later, and we don't see that mobile device anywhere. So we asked the people in charge, where's that mobile device? And they said, oh, we put it away in the drawer the same day you left. And this tells you that whatever problem they were solving with that device, it was not solving the operator's problem. It was meant to solve the management's problem, but there was no follow through, so it didn't solve that either. So that's one. Mm-hmm. The other one, from my personal experience at Utopia, years ago, before the AI revolution, we implemented automated production planning module for the MES system. And it was requested by the management at a food and beverage manufacturing facility. And the production planners assisted us in developing the software. And back then, I didn't realize that this was going to be a failure right out of the gate. When one of the most senior planners, privately, when he was talking to me about the different nuts and bolts of the system, he made a comment. He said, you know, we're never going to use it, right? And I said, why? And he said, because if we do, it's going to put us out of our jobs, because something that used to take a day may be done in minutes. And so from there, over the years, management kept coming back to it and saying, what can we do to actually use it? But then it was still never used. And I want to keep coming back to this story because it's real. Money was spent on building something that out of the gate, people knew that they were never going to use it on the lower level. So, and do you have any story like that, any anecdote you want to share that we can come back to?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. This one is a while back, but it's a popular one. It was about cell phone usage. and a very large global company had rolled out a policy, and the policy was meant to help driver safety, that people, while they were driving, couldn't use their phone. So that meant both taking calls and receiving them. And when you looked at the geographic territories that a lot of these were district managers at the time had to cover, they spent a lot of their time from their car office. So a lot of those implications weren't considered. And it was actually causing other issues as people were trying to follow the rules and driving off to the unsafe places on the sides of the road. And so it's so interesting to see kind of the workaround. And I think after a while, this was a global rollout, they decided this wasn't the right fit. They didn't think it through. They didn't talk to their stakeholders. And it's just amazing to see all of these changes, just like the stories you shared, where they're rolled out, but they're not rolled out with that end user in mind. And a lot of times they have to be pulled back, reconfigured. There's money spent on, like they said. So I hope we're going to unpack more of that today.
Absolutely. Sounds great. So the first question is, let's talk about what makes the change actually work. You talk about the people stack, and tell us more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I think that there is so much buzz around change management right now, but I don't think that means the same thing to every person. When they say those words, what does that mean? And we saw that at the conference, right? We saw a lot of presentations that said they were about change management and they were about people, and they were, but they weren't about the art and the science behind it, in my opinion. They were about maybe best practices in deployment. And when I think about what change management really is, it's about how are we going to help move people from point A to point B to adopt whatever process, system, technology that they need to. And in the business world, that's going to help our ROI and our business outcomes. There's going to be alignment there, right? But there's a challenge with all of that. And that really is because change management, when you think about it, the ability for somebody to make that change from point A to point B is a personal decision, right? So people have thoughts, feelings, and ideas. And at the end of the day, they're going to do whatever they want. And a lot of times there's not the time or discipline that's taken to help people understand why are we making this change. And sometimes there is, and sometimes that why even comes out in the wrong place. It might be the why for the company, but why? What does that mean for the individual, right? And I can give you some examples of that if you'd like to speak further on that one.
Let's just reiterate for people who are listening, because I have this come up every once in a while in the Industry 4.0 community. So when you say change management in plain English, what are we talking about? So we're all on the same page.
Yeah, it's the people side of change, right? So helping people move from point A to point B to adopt whatever process, system, or technology. And the outcome really is the business ROI.
All right. So you mentioned you had some examples, some stories. Please indulge us.
Yeah, well, most recently I was working with a team on a big SAP ERP implementation for a big manufacturer. And really pretty substantial change. And one of the things that's hard with those types of change, they're notorious for failure. I have to be honest, completely transparent with you. When people hear ERP, there's a stigma that comes with that. And one of the reasons I think, first of all, they're very complex changes. When you look about all of the integrations and things that are happening from a technology standpoint and what needs to be built and connected and talking to each other, et cetera, a lot of times there isn't the ability to co-create that with the end user. So a lot of times that's a frontline employee who has to actually behave differently, has to do something differently. And the value for the employee is not the same as the value for the customer. There might not be any value. Their job actually might take more steps rather than less, right? That's a really hard sell.
Yes, I can relate to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure you can. So, the successes that I've seen really go back to the shared values, right? What is the value for the individual? What is the value for the company? And finding common ground. And I think that people don't often take the time to think through these things, right? But, companies are in business for a reason. They're in business to make a profit. That's why they are a business. And employees are looking for stability. Companies are looking for growth. So I've found that that's a common thread that can be talked about as we think about how, as a company or an organization, how do they secure their future? Well, in the case of SAP ERP, they want better decision making. They want better data, right? They don't have systems that talk to each other. employees probably looking for stability of their job, right? So how do these two things intersect, and how do you begin to think about that as you talk about that why? And that's statistically, if you look at the reasons why projects and initiatives fail from a change standpoint, that's the number one reason, is they don't understand the why. But I add on to that and say that why needs to make sense for them as well.
Yes, absolutely. So we're back to that example of the mobile platform deployment. It didn't solve the problem of the operator. It was meant to solve management's problem. So when we talk about deployment of ERP, whose problem are we really trying to solve?
Yeah.
And I have been on the receiving end of such an upgrade to SAP back years ago when I worked at the major pharmaceutical manufacturer. And I can relate to that the messaging that frequently goes with these large scale initiatives is meant to just inform in a general way of what's happening, what you should be expecting as far as training is concerned, but they're not really going to the level of here's what that means for you, because there is a lot of people affected by this. And imagine making that change messaging individual, it must be hard. So I have been on that receiving end, and I remember the one big issue they had. I worked in finance at the time, and they spent millions of dollars to install SAP. It was 500 million, I think. I don't know how much of it was paid to IBM actually versus SAP for doing the installation. But they forgot some security settings, some security mechanisms. And so when it was done, you could only see your own department's data. But a lot of finance managers have to be the business partners to some other division. And so then they need access to see their financials. And it was either you see your own or you see everyone else's because you're a super user. So for some time, I was the super user of a major company because I needed the data. But that's not the right way to do this, obviously.
Yeah, no, you actually brought up a really good point there, because there's such an element of trust when you think about bringing people along, right? And how do you build that trust? And part of that is the why piece. But people kind of all go through this emotional journey, whether they want to or not. And this is the kind of the science part behind it. And when things like that happen, there's hiccups, and it does happen, right? People tend to slide back down on that continuum and revert back into their own ways, right? So you kind of move forward and figured out a solution, but others, when they're hitting a wall, whether that's new technology, new process, right? They're kind of reverting back into their old ways. And that's where you begin to see all those workarounds.
Yes, and the workarounds. So it's just ironic that after spending so much money on SAP, now I can tell you from another story from more recent experience. So the food and beverage company installed SAP at a brand new manufacturing plant. And a few years after that installation, they found employees downloading everything to Excel and then working from Excel.
Yeah.
So that's sliding into the old ways right there.
It is everywhere. I have another example, and it's not related to SAP, but it is related to cell phones. Here in New York State, all of the kids aren't allowed to have their cell phones on them at school.
Yep.
So they purchase these special pouches in our district, and the kids are supposed to keep their phone in the pouch and not use it, right? Well, when I saw that change coming, I was like, I wonder what the workarounds are going to be. Like, that was the first question that kind of popped into my mind. And, you've got the kids going to their car, so use their phone. You've got the pouches that don't work right are breaking phones, and so they're not using it. There's major resistance to that change. So just very interesting to kind of watch what's happening.
So as we talk about resistance, so let's talk a little bit about why good ideas struggle with change.
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, right? Because some of them are great ideas. I think that they're not fully vetted, right? Because when you want to have successful change, you want to create those ideas together. And I realize that's not always possible depending upon what type of change there is, whether that's kind of like a cultural change, right? Or a merger acquisition, a
Yeah.
technology change. Maybe there's some more ability, flexibility there. When you've got like leadership change, reorgs, that's different. That's not something you often co-create with the end user. But a lot of these technology and process ones, there is some flexibility and ability there. And the more you can bring people in, the less resistance you'll have. But resistance is something that we are all wired for, and it's going to naturally occur. So it's best to just plan for that and anticipate the types of resistance that you're going to have and really talk to the different stakeholders, understand what the pain points are, understand where the resistance is going to be, and bring them in as ambassadors when you can to help co-create that change together.
That's an awesome segue into our next topic. So let's talk about why people push back. What are they reacting to when they resist the change?
Yeah, it's fear. I mean, at a very, very, kind of very simple and basic level, it's fear of the unknown, right? And people that resistance presents itself in different ways. And I know we talked about that with the zoo animal exercise. You'll see everything from, we called it the ostrich, the ones that bury their head in the sand. I don't want to deal with this. This isn't happening, like almost in denial. You'll see people get aggressive and acting out almost as kind of like toddlers. That's more of a tiger persona. And that there's something behind that behavior, right? It's almost like a passion. There's a beaver persona where, they're kind of trying to uncover all the risks. We say they build up dams, but what they're really trying to do is keep whatever organization from making mistakes because they care. So a lot of these different behaviors are really kind of rooted in there is such fear about kind of making a mistake, but it's because they genuinely care, which says a lot, right? But they want, at the end of the day, they want to be included, they want to be heard, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's not always the time taken to kind of acknowledge that and really to talk through some of the challenges. And it's kind of a shame because I actually believe it has the ability to even make whatever is happening better, right? If they are included.
This is interesting. So just as a side note, I thought about this and still think about this a lot. When I think back about my military service in the US Marines, and there were parts of it that I loved, and there was something about what you just said that resonated with me that I wished I could change. And I know that lack of communication is sometimes by design. They would always explain it with operational security concerns. But in reality, what you said, everybody wants to be included. So my biggest issue, where I think, at least in my mind, maybe not in real consequences, but in my mind, I might have been part of the resistance myself. It's whenever you're not informed why something needs to be done, it looks maybe questionable. So like, get up and run right now. Like, why should I get up and run, right? So nobody explained that somebody's coming and we have to escape. So things like this, they were always a point of friction for me because there was always a lack of communication down to the lower ranks. And I wished that it was more like in the movies where they really explain to you what's about to happen and then you actually do it knowingly. Most of the time, you're doing things unknowingly and you just think, oh, this looks stupid. That, like what they're asking us to do could be done better, but I don't know why they're asking me to do this. So in the military, there's a lot of that where inclusivity at the level of being informed in the decision making could have been better. Of course, as you progress through the ranks, they include you more. But at the lower level, they just tell you what to do. And then you learn, oh, sometimes it's not really coming down all the way from the top. It's just somebody who decided to joke around and mess with me. So how can I tell the difference? I can't, but this inclusivity, yes, that resonates very well with me.
That is such a great example, and it makes me think of a few other things, to be honest with you, as well. Because I spent most of my career in communications and employee communications, and then I found this change management thing along the way that makes the communications actually stick. But I do think we underestimate the amount of socialization that it takes for a change to go well at all levels, like especially in these very large organizations,
Mhm.
helping each level understand, including the frontline employee. And that's really, again, that's where the rubber meets the road, because a lot of times that's the stakeholder group that's trying to implement whatever the change is. And
Yep.
there's sometimes so far removed from that decision. People think about communications in different ways, just like they think about change management. And many times communication to people means sending an email. And it's just, again, back to that socialization. I like to see where there's conversations enabled, where there's two-way dialogue, where there's really that depth and breadth of conversation. So it's really acknowledged and understood, and it's done multiple times. And I'll even give an example too, which kind of caught me a little bit off guard as change managing larger programs, is the project team sometimes needs to be change managed, which is not your primary audience when you're doing a big change. But I've had teams say to me, I don't want to talk to the frontline employees. We don't want to understand, or we're afraid we're going to uncover too many things, right? And again,
Wow.
it's kind of back to that fear, right? Of like, oh my goodness, what if they ask for something else? And I'm like, that's good. You want that information. So it's just really interesting, and that fear is kind of at the root of this whole thing.
This is priceless, I got to say, because I think about myself, what you just said. I think in my current role, when I work as a technology partner and a consultant with the manufacturers, I try to go after those things you just mentioned to uncover the real concerns of the frontline workers, because if you address those, then they're on board with you. But now, what you just mentioned, it makes me rethink some of the situations where I'm going there trying to uncover things, and sometimes the management is pushing the brakes a little bit. So it's the
Yeah.
fear on the management side that they won't be able to manage what they find.
Yeah, and
Very
I've
interesting.
seen that a lot. And I mean, I talk a little bit in some of the writing that I've done around insecure leadership, right? Of, folks kind of in the leadership roles not feeling comfortable with getting and receiving that feedback. So there's that piece of it. And then there's also kind of this power and control piece where, you'd mentioned about information cascading down all the way the organization. I've seen that a lot with like business updates, like the health of your business, wanting to share that all the way down the organization. And then you can share why you're doing XYZ project, right, to help that health. But a lot of times that information isn't even shared. So they don't know what the health of the company is.
Hmm.
They're not hearing it, right? And there was a fear of sharing what it is. And I don't know. I guess I'm just the type of person that says, but why not? Like, why wouldn't you want that? Why don't you want these people invested that work for you to understand that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also want to go back to one point you made about communication when you said for a lot of people, communication is just sending email. And I've been actually working with this for a good number of years, all of my career with my own business, plus years in the pharmaceutical company, where I've heard this long time ago. When it's a delicate issue, do not send an email, pick up the phone. And
Yeah.
I remember that even from days ago to now, every once in a while, somebody would say, you know, when you wrote that email, I don't know how to read it. I am reading it, maybe thinking you are agitated, or maybe not, but the tone doesn't come across as well as it does on the phone. And
Yeah.
so I try to manage myself to say, okay, if it's a delicate issue, it needs to be discussed in person. But let's talk about this. How do you see people lead when emotions run high?
It's tough. I mean, again, I spent a lot of my career in communications as air traffic controlling all the communications that went out for our North America region, and squashing things that what I would call weren't ready for prime time to protect operators in the field that were just getting bombarded
Hmm.
with so many different types of communications. So I did a lot of coaching with my internal clients, around kind of like what do you try, what do you want people to know and do with this information would be my first question. How do you want them to react, right? And we talk through it, and I'd be like, well, this isn't an email, this is a training. Or, this isn't an email, this is a leader getting up in front of these folks and answering questions. Or this is just a small group that this needs to go out to. It doesn't need to go to everybody. Or this one does need to go to everybody. Or did you know that this group is also communicating that same thing and you guys aren't talking to each other? So it's just very interesting to kind of see all of the different pieces come together. But I know you were talking about emotions, and for me, that goes back to trust, right? Like, again, especially if you're a leader of an organization, you are working to build trust with the people that work for you so they will follow you. And a lot of times that does not present itself as an email, right? Whether it's a conversation, and some of these large companies, can't be a one-on-one conversation, but can it be smaller groups? Can it be broken down? Can it be different voices, not always the same voice of leadership, but showing the different personas, what they do, helping to kind of humanize the leaders and to help people understand that they're real people that have got a job to do and they can't do that job alone. So, that for me, it makes me think about the pandemic, to be quite honest, and kind of how I was coaching leaders to communicate with their teams when they didn't have all of the answers, right? So there was a lot of fear of the unknown and uncertainty, and how do they keep people motivated, engaged, and moving forward when they themselves don't have all the answers? But them showing that to folks built more trust, right? Because they were showing their vulnerability, and that led more people to trust them. So it's just really interesting the way that cycle works.
And one side note about the pandemic that I observed with these meetings and information sharing, at least in the circles where my company communicates, we noticed one positive change. That was that people actually started turning on their cameras during meetings. Because before that, there were a lot of these rectangles or squares that said somebody's name and somebody's talking. Nobody wanted to turn on the cameras. And I think because we were so isolated during the pandemic, we saw, these people are on camera. So now when I go on Zoom or Teams calls, I'm always having my camera on. But what you said also brings an interesting memory. We were talking about this with a friend of mine, that the captain of a submarine always has to remain a captain of a submarine, even when he doesn't know what the next step is and where they need to go. And I've been in this situation with the small business a good number of times. So yeah, this is a very, very interesting topic in terms of sharing. And can you shed more light on the situations where that trust has eroded? And sometimes, the trust erodes, and we think about these really difficult situations where the bad situation has been there for a while, right? And it's like entrenched. But what I'm thinking, even in smaller episodes during day-to-day operations of a small business, there may be these pockets where there's friction, and we know that we may feel that we were right, but on the emotional level, now that trust you're talking about has gone down. So it doesn't matter who's right, who's wrong. If we want that change to happen in the future, we still need to kind of mend the fences and build the bridges. So let's talk a little bit more about that. How do you regain the trust? You're thinking just conversations, honest conversations, or is there anything else involved?
Yeah, so this is such a good one to unpack. So the first thing I'll say is, when I was talking about why changes fail, right? And I said the number one reason is the why. Well, the number two reason is the lack of active and visible sponsorship, right? And so that really kind of centers around this topic that we're talking about. The leader has to be present and active, right? And if they're an invisible force, they're not going to be seen or heard. They're not going to be trusted, right? Because I really believe that trust is built by saying, doing what you say you're going to do. And that trust tends to erode when those things don't happen, right? So leader gets up, they make a speech, we're doing X, Y, Z, it's going to be great. And then maybe nothing happens. or maybe a new leader comes in. You know what I mean? Like, there's all sorts of things that could kind of turn the tables around, and start to kind of break that trust and credibility. But there's got to be a way, whether it's consistent updates of what's going on, really keep bringing the people along, helping them feel that involvement, so that they can continue to build that trust. And I'll say that trust looks different. We've got 5 generations in the workplace right now. Trust looks different in every generation. I think about a baby boomer and kind of handshake trust, right? Like there's just different. It meant different things to different generations. I think about my children, right, and kind of the age of instant gratification. Trust might not mean the same thing to their grandparents.
I really
So
like this. So let's dive a little
yeah,
bit deeper into this, because when we are talking to people that we work with on a daily basis, they span different generations. So
yeah,
it would be very, very helpful to understand this a little bit deeper, because yes, we work with some younger individuals, with some older individuals, and it's always, to me, it's always personal, like what kind of rapport, what I feel in my communication with that person,
yeah.
how I carry myself with that person. But tell me more. So, like, trust at different levels, generationally. So, if there are any
Yeah.
nuggets of wisdom you can share.
I would say, I mean, I think I took a really good Cornell class for one of my certifications around this, and it's almost like a reflection of how you feel about yourself. And I don't know, like some people, trust people very easily and tend to be
Mhm.
very naive, right? And others are like, I've been burned before, right? I'm not going to make that mistake again. And whether that shows up in their personal life or their professional life, it can be different. But it's almost like you can see it a mile away. Sometimes leaders will promise the moon and stars where they probably shouldn't promise that, right? Where
Mhm.
this is going to change everything. Well, is that really true? And I think, people that are skeptical begin to unpack, is that really the truth? Do they really mean it? Why are they saying it like that? Are they saying it because they want it? Okay, I get that, but it's not real. What is true, right? So I just think it's a reflection of thinking about how you view people, from a trust standpoint, and then I tend to be more careful about what I try to promise. Like, I want to deliver on what I say I'm going to do. So I don't want to make promises that I can't keep, because that will erode trust and credibility with folks.
That's admirable. Yes, very,
Yeah.
very good way to put it. And this is bringing up another point that we wanted to talk about. So when we talk about trust, and then we think about the leaders who actually understand that this is the only way that they can get major accomplishments, major goals achieved, is to give that, to have that trust with their people. And so
Hmm.
that brings up the memory of leadership in David Marquette's approach, where the leaders delegate. So let's talk about that a little bit. When leaders don't have all the answers, and they don't necessarily even have to have all the answers.
Yeah, I think they shouldn't have all the answers, right? Because they're not leading by themselves, they're leading a team, and they need that team to help them. And I think that's what's so important, is that the smart leaders recognize that they are not doing this alone, right? They need to talk to their teams. They need to understand, because a lot of times they're making decisions around things that their teams are doing actively, but they're not in the trenches doing them, right? So they need those teams and those other middle managers to be their eyes and ears to help them create whatever the solution is or the next move together. And I think that is so critically important.
Yes, absolutely. And for our audience who may not be familiar with David Marquette's story, there is a video on YouTube where he's talking about the situation on the submarine, because he was submarine captain, and he was assigned to a new submarine that he was not familiar with. And he had a deadline by which everybody had to be trained, and they needed to have that submarine ready for an operation. And he knew that if he spent the time by himself to study every part of that submarine, it would take forever. So he delegated it, but then he had to trust that the people he delegated it to would carry out everything diligently so that they would be ready. And it was a major success story. And now we're seeing leaders try to adopt that approach in US manufacturing. And it's slowly starting to work. I can't say whether it's widespread or not, but I am seeing it myself. So there's clearly something to it, with the delegation to the people who, like you said, who see it, live it, and breathe it on a daily basis, to then come up with the recommendations on how these goals need to be achieved. So at least at their level, because they're part of it, there's not going to be resistance. Now, at the lowest level of people who are affected by change, we still need to be mindful. So the way I see that, in those situations, there's one particular company and one particular site where I can clearly picture how this is managed. They basically make the lower level people, they treat them as experts. So those experts then are asked for their opinion. And when they're asked for their opinion, they make the recommendations, and then those recommendations are analyzed and weighed against each other. But they all feel important. So there's this core team, lowest level. But because of that, they're feeling important. It's the most effectively run site, most efficient site in the company. So that's just, I'm very lucky to have observed that, and I wish more companies try to follow that practice. But
what a great example. And back to the trust, right? You're building two directions of trust, right? Up and down the organization. So thanks for sharing that example.
Yeah, so this goes to control versus ownership. So you give up at the leadership level that control, and you make the lower level people own the results. And you can tell them, I don't know, it doesn't always work this way, but I tried to tell people, think of yourself as a business owner. If you knew you were not an employee, but the business owner, what would you do? And in a lot of cases, it brings that aha moment, and people start to think, well, if it was my money, I would do X, and it's that kind of attitude. When you see it at the lowest level, it really pays off.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing in this notion of this empathetic leadership too, as I think about kind of where we've been in the leadership journey, right? And there was really kind of more of this dictator mentality. You will do as I say I do, and that's why you'll do it. And now it's really kind of this notion of I can still hold people accountable to do what they need to do and include them, right, as part of the solution.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
I just think that we're seeing this shift, and a lot of people are having aha moments with that.
And now for the most pressing and urgent issue in change management stratosphere, the introduction of AI. In what
Yeah.
we were just talking about, that trust, right? So let's talk about how trust carries over into the AI revolution and what we're seeing today, because maybe you have more, but I see two groups of people. I see people who are jumping into it and trying to go in step with the changes that are happening and learn more and more and more. And I see people taking a back seat, and there are a lot of conversations where people feel threatened by AI. People feel that it's coming for their jobs. And we as practitioners have to still make these projects, these initiatives work. Some of them didn't originate in the AI sphere. They didn't have AI-driven primary goals. They were just business objectives, something like make this particular process or this department more efficient. How can we do it? But now, if we're starting to touch on AI, it's sort of in the air that there is this threat and there is that fear. So what, if anything, can you share with us for the business leaders to just act in a way that they don't promote the fear.
Yeah, so fear is such an interesting emotion, right? Because really it's so closely related to anxiety when I think about kind of how does it balance itself out. And anxiety is not an unhealthy thing. Everybody has anxiety, but sometimes our anxiety can run away with our brain and try to protect us, right? It's trying to figure out every scenario that it can possibly figure out so it can prepare us for that, even though the scenario will probably be something that we've never even imagined before of what happens, right? The way I like to help people through that in general, not just with AI, is to help them remember to stay in the present. Not that we don't plan for the future, right? But a lot of times we're so far down the lane of saying, what if this, what if this, what if this, right? And it's not saying that you don't want contingency plans, because you absolutely do. But sometimes that energy is detracting us from what's actually happening in the present, right? So when I come back to, okay, what's going on with AI right now? Lots of experimentation, right? Lots of headlines that are causing people to panic and maybe jump to conclusions. And are some of them true? Maybe. But what do we know? We know that this is going to change the way jobs look in the future. We know that for sure, right? That
Yep.
is something that we can absolutely count on. So how do we prepare for that? Like that, those are the types of questions that I tend to ask leaders. And I think there is this notion of AI is like a quick fix for every single operational problem that's happening right now. And that's not necessarily true either, right? Like there needs to be solid process technology strategy in place, right? And AI can enhance that, but it's not, if things are broken, and I've seen companies do this, throwing a bunch of AI when we don't have a strategic vision of how that complements whatever we're going to do is not going to solve the problem. So I don't know. I guess, and I just want people to kind of take a deep breath and really think about what do we know right now to be true, right? And how, based on that, how do we move forward?
Absolutely. And when you just said when the processes are broken and you throw AI at it, you know, I thought about that a lot because it's actually quite interesting. There's a lot of people, including my mentor Walker Reynolds from Industry 4.0, who says to people, stop, make sure that before you throw AI at it, you have a working process, you understand what you're doing. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, well, maybe, just maybe, somebody will listen to him, but there will be a lot of people who will not. And that's what makes the time that we live in very interesting, because you can't take all those companies with the broken processes and stop them from running off the cliff. They're going to run off the cliff anyway. Some of
Yes.
them are going to do it faster than others, but it's going to be an interesting experience for everyone to observe. And I think, yes, a lot of people are afraid, and like you said, just stop and think, what's going on? Why are we panicking? And it doesn't help, I must say, when the big companies, CEOs come out and say, yes, AI will take everybody's jobs away. Like
Yeah.
I'm hearing that, especially when people talk about it in Davos, Switzerland, when they're getting for the big company get-togethers and with political leaders. That doesn't help. And I don't know if they understand, actually. I just want to make a side note here. Whenever Sam Altman talks about this utopia that he predicts, that, well, all the jobs are going to change, but we're going to be so well off because we're just not going to know what to do with our time. And the AI is going to do these great things for us. And I'm thinking, like, does he really think that people believe that? Because there will be other people who will control all this. It will never be in a situation where everyone is equally able to harness the benefits of all the AI inventions. There will be the ones that control it and the ones that don't. And this is going to be very, very interesting how it plays out. But what would you say? I think about that group of people that actually tries to learn all along as this comes out and adopt their ways. To me, when I observe it in the family and among friends, I think it's the way to go about it, because the sooner you adjust, the easier the mental switch is going to be. What do you think?
Well, 100%. I mean, it's funny because for me, it goes back to there's different change management frameworks. The Cotter one is really the one about the emotional journey. And, it kind of talks about when people learn of a change, some people get really excited about it. And then all of a sudden there's this, well, what does this mean? What does this mean for me, right? And they tend to kind of slide down this slope of where the anxiety hits. The very bottom of that slope is called the valley of despair. Some people never come out of that valley of despair. But the ones that can move themselves back up the hill to that acceptance and start to think about some of those positive possibilities are the smart people, right? Who are kind of leaning in and embracing the change that's going to happen, like in this case, AI. Some people will never get to that acceptance, but there's a saying that says the warrior suffers twice. So kind of back to our conversation about anxiety and how the brain is manifesting all these things, but acceptance is the pathway to peace. So the sooner you can get to that acceptance, and it doesn't have to be an emotional journey, but it can be, when you get there, it's just being curious or being, just that, it's a fact that things are going to change. I've accepted that, right? And then, well, what does that mean? What could that mean? What could that look like? And then start to begin to think about the positive possibilities of the change.
I love how you put it. Acceptance is the pathway to peace. I love it. I love it. So we wanted to talk about two more things. So if people really liked this conversation that we've had, what would you say, where can they learn more about the different tools and frameworks, and where can they learn more about the specific approach that you use?
Yeah, great question. So I do have a website, juliewhittenconsulting.com. It has some general information on there, but I do write a series of articles on LinkedIn called the Big Girl Panties Diaries, and they're about life and leadership lessons. But I talk a lot about the parallels between personal life and organizations and some of the challenges that we have in personal lives and how organizations are having similar challenges. And I begin to talk about some of those frameworks and resistance and a lot of the things that we've discussed today. There are quite a few frameworks out there when it comes to change management. I think ADKAR is probably the most famous one that people are aware of, which is more centered around individual change, and that organizational change requires a series of individual changes, and people have to move, as we talked earlier, from point A to point B. We were just speaking most recently, with not even knowing it, on the emotional journey on the Fisher model. That really kind of speaks to the emotion side and the journey that everybody, no matter what, is going to go through as a change. But people travel through that journey, as we spoke about, in different places, and some of them get stuck in certain ways, and some of them even revert back into their old ways. And then the Cotter one is probably one of the more famous ones, and that's really talks a lot about organizational change. So one of the things that I like to do as an experienced change and practitioner is kind of mold. I take the best of all of those models, and I work with organizations to create custom models that make sense for their business. So whatever organization it is, we build a custom model and tool set and training for leadership capability around that.
I love it, because what you just said with the custom model resonates with me, because no one solution fits every situation. And I see that in manufacturing. You know how you can buy a piece of software, but does that software solve all your problems? Most of the time, no, right? So you are then facing the situation where the manufacturer actually wants you to customize it to their liking so that it addresses their problems. And what you just said with the model, it makes so much sense. A custom model. And where do we learn more about the zoo model? Is that on your website?
Yeah, I do have an article on LinkedIn where I wrote about the exercise, and I tend to use this a lot to teach people about how they view change and act in the face of change within themselves as an individual. Because as we were just talking about, organizational change requires a series of individual changes, but how do you help others with that change if you don't understand how you lead through change, right? So there's an article on LinkedIn that I've written, and it's just search Julie Whitten resistance, and the zoo personas will come up, and happy to speak more. But I get a lot of folks that I've done that exercise with so many different companies, so many different levels of organizations. And people just really kind of gravitate towards it. And I think it's because it's just so relatable of helping people understand how they act in the face of change and how they see others acting. And then there's like, okay, well, I know, I'm a beaver and I uncover a lot of risks, or I'm an owl and I have a lot of institutional knowledge and I ask a lot of questions because I'm passionate. Well, then what do you do with that, right? So as part of the training I do, we talk about what are the prescriptions as you start to see some of these personas of how do you, as a leader, help people through this change.
And one thing I'd like to add is why I gravitated to that approach right away when I saw it. It's because it's not only relatable, it's fun. So I try to find in all this work that we do elements that could be fun and point them out to my colleagues, because fun is rewarding when you can have fun at work. And the zoo classification, it's relatable and it's fun. So with that, to wrap up, the last question, and I guess we sort of answered it already, but I would still go back to it. Why would you say the go live of any major project or initiative isn't the finish line?
Oh my gosh, that is such a great question because everybody assumes it is the finish line, right? Okay, so I'm going to talk about this from a scientific standpoint and then kind of build up around that. But when you think of specifically the ADKAR model, so awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, reinforcement, right? You're talking about ability always needs to line up with go live. And there's a reason for that because reinforcement comes next. So in some models, it's called sustainment. And I think what happens a lot of times in large projects, there's a dedicated team that's supporting these changes and initiatives, a project team. There's people helping, it go live, whether it's white glove service of helping, kind of make it, just stand it up, right? And then everybody leaves. And what happens I've seen is people move on to the next shiny object. And if we're not holding people accountable to sustain the behaviors that they've just learned, they revert back into their old ways, right? And and it's a shame because you've spent so much time and money and resources on that. And so I think the next question to follow that is, so how do you sustain things, right? Especially, even kind of in smaller projects where you don't have a project team, and it's about how do you embed whatever change you made into the culture, whether that's routines or processes, daily huddles that you're talking about it, you're walking around, you're reinforcing. So it's really, in my mind, that leadership observation piece is so critical to that sustainment, and it's often missed. It's a shame.
Yes, and I would say this brings a memory. We've had this internal discussion in my company about when we deploy something, we get to observe whether that solution that we deployed is getting used correctly or not. And we try to maintain our reputation, not only through impeccable service, but also through making sure that whatever we do adds value to the business. And so we've had these discussions where all our team members have to speak up when they see that the end users got, I don't know, a spaceship and they're trying to use it as a hammer. You need to speak up as soon as you see it, because the longer you let it slide, the more these things tend to accumulate into a snowball, and then it's harder to fix. But if we as leaders, just like you said, walk around or see how people use the solutions you gave them, and it makes sense, then it's great. You keep the communication open, ask them for their feedback for any improvements that could be made that they can come up with. And I noticed that when you ask people for suggestions for improvement, they open up and
Yes.
they feel more accepting and welcoming change when they're part of it. And yeah, so this has been a great conversation. I think we've got a lot of good nuggets of wisdom here. So I would love to keep talking to you. And I want to wish you success with all the work you've been busy with since we met at the Connected Worker. So this has been a great productive conversation. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have learned something from it. So thank you, Julie.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.